This is Professor Krasner. I am talking to you through technology about English 518. And I want to start by talking about how we're going to read the Bible in this class. This is a Bible as literature class. What the heck does that mean? Well, partly the idea is just to read the Bible. Honestly, that's the reason a lot of people take it. We're just going to read it. We're going to read most of it. We're going to read all the stories. That's sort of the selection process I'm using. But to understand that idea of reading stories, you need to sort of think about how we usually read the Bible. And when we are thinking about the Bible, we don't think of it as a normal book. We think of it very much in the context of a religious experience. We think of it as a sacred text, which is what it is. But you don't treat a sacred text like a normal book. You don't read it in the way that you would read a novel, which is how we're going to try to read the Bible. So let me talk about that a little. The normal way you see people read the Bible when you go to church, when you go to synagogue, is through what's called typological reading. And this is especially true in Christian churches. And that's basically reading for symbols. The idea of typology is that every story in the Bible is really a story about Jesus. Every story is sort of pointing towards Jesus. Jesus is the guy that matters. So that's, for example, Samson. Here's the story of Samson, right? And the story of Samson ends in this totally dramatic way where he is tied to the two pillars in the Temple of Dagon, and he pushes down the pillars and he kills all the Philistines. And a typological reading would say, well, that image of Samson with his arms out like that is supposed to remind us of Jesus being crucified. And so Samson's sacrificial death prefigures Jesus' sacrificial death. Story of David and Goliath, where David triumphs over the big, strong, evil guy, is a kind of prefiguring of the story of Jesus triumphing over the devil in the temptation in the wilderness. So that way of seeing the Bible is that everything is really about Jesus, and it helps us it points us towards Jesus. Everything that happens before Jesus' life and after Jesus' life are all symbols. And this is basically a symbolic way of reading. You're not reading the stories themselves, you're reading for symbols. So if you were in an English class, and you know how sometimes you're in an English class, so you're reading The Great Gatsby, right? And your teacher is telling you that Gatsby is a symbolic of the American dream, and Daisy is symbolic of idealism. Tom represents corruption, and blah, blah, blah. The yellow car represents hubris. The light at the end of the dock is like a symbol of this. And that's fine. But deep down, some of you are thinking, give me a break. Can't we just see these people as people? Like, Gatsby is a person. Daisy is a person. Daisy's like an idiot, Tom's a jerk. Nick is boring. The yellow car is a friggin' yellow car, all right? This idea that everything has to turn into something else sometimes drives you nuts when you're reading a regular novel. And what you really want to do when you're reading The Great Gatsby is leave those symbols aside and read it for the story, right? This is a story about people who have emotions. You want to respond as if you were dealing with actual people with real personalities and actual emotions. You look at the characters, you look at the story, the dialogue. You do this in English class too, but sometimes that need to read symbolically gets overwhelming. So we're willing to do this with novels. We're willing to say enough with the symbols already. Let's read for the story. But we don't do that with the Bible. We tend to read it for symbols. The other way that we often will read it is what I would call pedagogical reading. Look at this guy. He's so happy. He's up there. He's giving his homily. He's telling you the lesson that the Bible teaches you. So instead of specifically identifying something as a symbol of Jesus, there's a lesson there for your life about how to be a good Christian, how to be a good person. So you read David and Goliath, and then the lesson that this story teaches is, and you get a little moral. God helps you overcome any challenge, even if you're just a little guy like David, and you just have a slingshot and there's a big strong Goliath. God can help you overcome it. the lesson that the Samson story teaches is, even when things are bad, well, it's sort of like the same lesson. This is one of the problems with like the lesson approach. They always sort of boil down to trust in God and everything will be fine. But anyway, there's nothing wrong with this way of teaching either. It's more like a thematic approach, but it still doesn't involve reading the Bible as you would a story in which there are characters and plot and dialogue. What happens if we read the Bible that way? If we look at David as a character who has emotions, we look at Samson as a character who makes mistakes, whose story starts here and ends here. He's not a symbol, he's not like a big lesson, he's a person who did things, most of which were stupid. He's a big, muscly idiot who makes all these mistakes and he tries to make up for them. So you read for the story and you have these impressions of people. What happens if you read for the story in David and Goliath? David comes off as this courageous guy who's sort of a little in love with himself. Goliath is this bully. King Saul, the relationship between David and Saul, which we're going to look at, is really complicated. And he's this admirable, gruff military leader, but he really doesn't see important things that David sees. And then there's God. And God in this story very much is somebody who wants to be the center of attention. He focuses on David instead of Saul because Saul doesn't prioritize him. And already you're probably feeling a little uncomfortable, right? This is weird. This is the really weird thing. The idea that God is a character. If we're going to read the Bible for character, plot, dialogue, God is the main character. He's the only character who's in it all the way through. And if you're going to read the Bible as a novel, with God as the main character, then the basic plot of the Bible is God tries to establish relationship with people, and it screws up, and then it screws up again, and then it screws up again, and he keeps trying, and he keeps trying. It's a long story of a constantly failing, but constantly emotionally intense, yearning relationship. And the big problem I think that people have is especially about emotions. The idea that God has emotions, that he's a personality with emotions, who's emotionally attached to people, and who gets upset, and who gets worried, and who gets sort of happy and sad and angry. And we're used to this God who's kind of like perfect and withdrawn, and nothing phases him. He's like this old bearded guy who's just like hanging out, giving the peace sign. You know, he's just nothing bothers him. He knows everything. He sees everything. Everything's basically. And the truth is, that is not the God who's in the Bible. The God in the Bible is a guy with a lot of emotion. He gets very, very angry. He gets very, very sad. This is a passage that we're going to look at like next week, describing how God feels right before the flood. It repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. He's really sad and upset about all the evil that people are doing, and so he decides to destroy the world. When the children of Israel at Mount Sinai build the golden calf, he gets furious. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, he says to Moses. I don't want to get so mad that I kill everybody. And Moses talks him out of it. It's not that God is always mad. Sometimes he feels very loving towards people. Sometimes he's sweet. And behold, I am with thee. I will keep thee in all places whither thou goest. I will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee. That's a very touching passage. He's talking to Jacob. But the truth is, God is angry a lot in the Old Testament. And that's the way the story shows him, the way the story portrays him. And people have trouble with this. I mean, people say, oh, God's supposed to be nice. I had a student once who said, when is God going to get nice in this story? And, I would say, you got to wait a long time. partly that's just because you're dealing with something that's written at a time when power and anger went together. But partly I think it's because God has a personality of someone who's very attached. He really, really cares about this. He really, really wants it to work. The thing that kills me about God is that he just doesn't give up. Like, why doesn't he just, even at the beginning, he should just give up. Because all they do is screw up. The whole story is that God tries to find a way to get people to behave themselves, and people screw up. That's the whole story, over and over. And it just drives him nuts, but he keeps trying because he really, really cares. This vision of a God who cares so much, who's so emotionally attached, who's not that distant, Colonel Sanders guy, but who's just like so focused on people and so desperate to connect with them. That is the God that you see in the Bible if you read God as a character. And it takes some getting used to, but that's how we're going to approach it. Now, I am not saying that the Bible is a novel or that this is the right way to read it. I am not saying that it is wrong to read it as a sacred text or read it in a theological or typological way. I'm saying, let's try this. Let's use the skills that we would use if we were reading a novel and see what happens. See what kind of insight we get into God. And in my experience, people who are very religious actually get some useful insights out of this. People who are not religious at all, and this is the first time you've read the Bible, that's a nice way into it, instead of there being this sort of wall between you and the Bible where you sort of don't get what's going on and you're trying to understand how you're supposed to approach these characters. The other thing, of course, is that we're taking a whole bunch of books and we're reading them as though they were one long book, which is also a pretty artificial thing to do. People who are the sort of orthodox view would be that God has inspired the Bible. It's all written by him. And so from that point of view, you can certainly say it's one book. God put it together the way he did. He's the editor. He's the writer. He wants the story to be told this way. So what's God's story? Let's read it as a story and see what happens.